Right, welcome back to our special coverage of the commemorative two-year anniversary of the Tinubu administration since it came to power in 2023. This time around, we're doing a final lap of our broadcast this afternoon by doing a comparative analysis of the first 2 years of the past 5 presidents that we've had since the return of democracy back in 1999. So that means we're going to take a look at the Obasanjo years, the first 2 years from 1999 to 2002. We're also going to take a look at the Yar'Adua years, the Goodluck years, the Buhari years, and how they compare to the Bola Ahmed Tinubu administration in terms of what the data and the indices suggest. Joining me for this part is our business editor, Yusuf. Akogu will be helping me analyze some of the figures. Yusuf, obviously people are going to look at the data and make up their own conclusions about why things are shaping up the way they're shaping up. But let's look at what history is telling us about the first few years of the past presidents. We start with the former general, the retired general, Olusegun Obasanjo, when he came up into power in 1999. It's quite suggestive that he took over a battered economy, especially if you look at what we're seeing right now. 65.6% poverty rate. And of course, our debts at that moment was around 28 or 29 billion. Changed a little later, back the next year with inflation at 6.9%, exchange rate going slightly up, and we saw that progressive and continued push of the naira against the dollar. But of course, most importantly for most people is the poverty level, right, at 64%. We saw a slight increase from 1999 to 2000. And of course, public debt was hovering around 28 billion. This was when the Obasanjo administration was still trying to work out those deals around debt forgiveness. But what do you think are some of the takeaways here? Because this was pretty much a new era, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at in 1999, when the new administration came in at the time, Olusegun Obasanjo taking over from the military government, the inflation number was at a single digit,
right?
All right, which is something that we must emphasize on, considering where we are right now. 6.9% was considerate, and of course, the government of then, General Sani Abacha, met inflation at 54%. Don't forget the crisis of June 12.
Right.
Within the period of 5 years, he was able to move inflation from that 54% to less than 9% at the time. So when Abubakar took over, he brought it down to the level it were before Obasanjo came in on May 23, 1999. Single digit, 6.6% at the time.
Right.
If you look at the exchange rate at the time, just that's the black market
naira,
rate.
Yeah,
that's the black market rate. Yes, in the 92 naira and 34 kobo to the dollar. Of course, the poverty rate was a little bit high.
I think for me, this was the telling moment.
Absolutely.
Because at that moment, the poverty was quite severe, if you ask me. Not just because it's 65% of the population, but it's quite significant considering the sanctions that the Abacha administration has had to deal with up until the moment Abdullahi took over, and then the Obasanjo years
and of course, the population at the time was not as high as what we have right now. All right, so this is 65% at the time was very, very significant. Yeah. But given where we are, but he was able to, despite that, he was able to at least put a few things in place, and of course, got Nigeria to, to achieve debt forgiveness at the time. Talking about what we achieved from the Paris Club with the Paris Club.
Exactly.
So it's also a very good one that he was able to maintain the trajectory along this line. But if you want to compare to what we are today, given where we were,
I think the most important figure for me is the inflation and the exchange rate.
Absolutely.
Which today look like a completely different story. Well, let's talk about the man who took over from Obasanjo in 2007. What were the years like for the late former president, Umaru Musa Yar'Adua? Look at the inflation figures. My goodness. This is something that we've probably never seen in years. From 6%, it went down to 5.4%.
Absolutely.
Take us through how this pretty much impacted the lives of Nigerians at that moment.
All right. So, Yar'Adua coming in. At the time Obasanjo left, the inflation number was, he was able to drive them significantly down to this level where Yar'Adua met it at 5.4% within his first year in office. If you look at the exchange rate, 125 naira, 83 kobo to the dollar. Of course, the poverty rate also dropped from 65% to 54%. Percent as well. The public debt
also
went down to 20 billion naira, but it's not the same thing that we're seeing today. Everything is on the rise. More like the law of gravity doesn't apply anymore.
Exactly.
Now, when you look at that, we discovered that quite a whole lot of policies and programs of some of these government were actually pro-people policies.
Yeah.
All right, the policies that take the larger population into consideration. But it's not the same today. But though, as of 2008, we saw inflation moving up there as well. We saw also the exchange rate appreciating against the dollar. Don't forget, it was 125 to the dollar, but it came down to 118 to the dollar at the time. Of course, the poverty level was also on the decline as well.
If you ask me, Yusuf, I think this is when we started witnessing the pivot, because from here on out, the numbers never looked the same anymore.
Absolutely.
It was pretty much like a downward spiral. The exchange rate, the inflation figures kept going up and up.
And don't forget, the Yar'Adua government was one of the government that was so concerned about building Nigerian foreign buffers, talking about foreign reserves. As at the time he left office, he passed away. I think our reserve was close to 67.
You still have the exchange screwed account.
Absolutely, to $64 billion or thereabout as well. So we had enough money to finance our import duties, our foreign obligations. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's take a look at the Goodluck years. What were the first 2 years like for the accidental quote-unquote president that a lot of people like to refer to him as? Well, he took over, and this is pretty much what the situation was like, the outlook, right? As of 2010, inflation was at 13.7%. Like I did say, this was the beginning, the pivot to a downward spiral for the economy. Exchange rate at 115 naira. To the dollar, 29 kobo. Poverty slightly coming down a little bit, 48.3%. Debt, of course, the ballooning, the inflation began in terms of our public debt. It's around 35.1 billion US dollars. This was just 15 years ago, mind you. 15 years ago.
Indeed. And don't forget, Jonathan government was more like a continuation of Yar'Adua administration. So after he passed away, he took over. So inflation was at this level at over 30%. But in 2011, when he recontested,
brought it back down a little bit.
Down to about a little above 10%. And of course, the exchange rate was still hovering around 150. If you look at it, the difference is not so much. You can actually look at the years. I mean, in terms of the number of years that it took us to get to that level, but you can't say that today. But the poverty level came down to 46%. It means that
these were good years.
A good number of Nigerians were actually making progress at this point. I mean, the level of difficulties that we have now is not something that was there at the time, but our debt kept rising.
Yeah, exactly.
That's something that we should look at.
That is the main figure. As far as the Goodluck years were concerned, this is one of those things that got a lot of people talking about how the debt profile was beginning to balloon. But more importantly is the fact that at that moment in time, cost of living was not necessarily a very big issue, Yusuf, because things were still affordable. I mean, look at the exchange rate, 155 naira, 76 kobo to the dollar as at 2011. So 14 years ago, this was the trajectory. Well, how about the man that changed the game in 2015? General Muhammadu Buhari retired, who took over from Goodluck Jonathan in 2015. Well, look at the inflation figures, still pretty much something stable, 9%, right, in the first year. The exchange rate was a bit higher, but also poverty was quite high. Remember, this was against the backdrop of all the insurgency in the northeast, the Boko Haram insurgency that helped make things rather difficult for the Goodluck administration. But also, in this first year, in 2015, public debt rose to a significant high, record high at that point, $63.8 billion.
Now, if you look at the inflation number, which is one number that is very key here that we should look at, as at the time President Goodluck Jonathan left office in 2015, the inflation number was at 9%, which is still a single digit within the CBN target at the time. But if you look at where we are today, we can't even go into that. But we must give Buhari government credit for something. He was one who was so particular about keeping Nigeria exchange rate very, very low against the US dollar. I mean, at an advantage level against the dollar. But at the time, the naira was devalued at the time. That was when he was sick and, of course, out of the country. And when he came back, I listened to him, and he did say he was not happy with the result he was getting from the CBN with regards to the exchange rate. But
also, quite telling, Yusuf, is that a year, this is how big of a difference a year can actually make. From 9% in 2015 in 2016, because this was the year of the recession, mind you, the first few recessions that Buhari administration has to deal with. We went from 9% inflation figures to 15.7%. And exchange rate also ballooned significantly to 300 naira to the dollar. poverty level pretty much still high in the 60s, and our debt also kept going up, 57.4%. And this was the beginning of the disillusionment of the change agenda, because a lot of people bought into that whole idea in 2015. But the next year, I think reality began to dawn on Nigerians that things are not necessarily going pretty smoothly for
I think at this point, what happened was that if you look at the time where sometimes I credit Buhari, a lot of people keep asking me, why are you doing so? Because some think he's supervised over one of the worst administration in Nigeria, which I think is not so. Between 2015 and 2016, if you look at the crude oil prices at the international market at the time, it was below $30 per barrel.
Right.
And don't forget, this is where we rely so
maybe
much
that explains
to finance
this
our
part.
budget. Of
That
course, we need to
explains this
borrow
part.
at the time.
Yeah.
I did remember him saying that, look, if the crude oil prices remain the way it is, that he was not going to seek a re-election at the time. But we were able to actually, rise above that. But exchange rate at 305 at the time, but he was still able to keep it at that level for close to 8 years till he left office at the time, which I think is something that is very, very considerable. But the poverty level was on the rise. Don't forget, before he left office, we had about 133 million Nigerians in multidimensional poverty.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Well, let's take a look at the man of the hour, the man of the moment. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu came into power in May of 2023, and this is the outlook pretty much of the first year in office, 24.6%. I think Nigerians will be begging for us to get back to this particular point at this point. But of course, this is what he inherited in terms of the exchange rate, which is quite a sharp difference to what we have right now. Poverty at 71.2%. Look at that. The debt burden, 113.4 billion. I mean, let's get into year two. Perhaps that would provide a lot more clarity about what happened last year for the Tinubu administration, right? But Yusuf, obviously this is as bad as it got for any president. Nobody took over the charge of this country with these statistics, with these indicators, right?
Yeah.
Did this explain what came after for the Tinubu administration, in your view?
Well, one thing that we must, we cannot excuse him, because he did told us that he actually begged for the job, that he was actually ready to continue from where the former president, Muhammadu Buhari, actually stopped. So he met inflation at this number, 24.6%, which was not very, very palatable at the time, because if you look at where it were when they came in 2015, of course, you know that they've not really done so well in terms of managing inflation. Of course, as at 2024, this is 33.7%, the highest that we got before the rebasing of the CPI at the time. Of course, the exchange rates, if this 2024 number as at today is about 1,600 and something or thereabout. The poverty level is 74%, and that number is still debatable, because a lot of people are saying it's
a lot more than that. Yeah,
absolutely. And of course, our debt profile, if you add the new borrowing plan, it could actually head into $200 billion.
Exactly. So, absolutely. I mean, these are the figures, right? And for the most part, a lot of people take these figures into consideration when trying to analyze and assess the performance. I mean, some of it is asset and liabilities that you've taken over, but most of it, for the most part, a lot of people would say is, what kind of policies are you trying to implement? What kind of programs are you trying to design to take Nigeria's economy to greater height? But of course, these numbers have the possibility of changing for the best, hopefully, for Nigerians.
And don't forget, this is within a year or thereabouts that we are having this number. We don't know what will happen by the time this administration spend maybe 4 or 8 years in office.
So, but looking at these inflation figures, I mean, obviously we have a much lower inflationary figure after the rebasing, as you did point out, right? But some things have not changed. This has not changed for the better. This has not changed for the better. This, of course, obviously a lot of people would debate.
And it may never change for the better.
Exactly. And then this particular part, which, as we all know, the recent request by the president to get some more 24 billion to inject into the financing of capital projects for 2025 and 2026. Obviously, the other ones are all in the negative for the most part. But the Tinubu administration would like Nigerians to believe that all of this is still work in progress.
Absolutely, work in progress. But well, the most important thing that we must also know is that governance is all about the people. Whatever policies or programs you are introducing or implementing, as long as the people are not benefiting from it, then to me, it is actually a waste of time.
One point before we go, Yusuf, is the fact that all of these past presidents that we've analyzed their first 2 years in office have had some sort of major subsidy, especially in the petroleum sector, for instance, right? The Tinubu administration is the only administration that has had to deal with zero subsidy, so to say, quote unquote, because people still argue that there were some elements of subsidy still at play even last year. Do you think that makes a lot of difference, especially regarding inflation figures and, you know, this aspect where they obviously need to finance some of these humongous projects that they are embarking on?
Yeah, in terms of making a difference, again, you have to, it boils down to what I said earlier, talking about governance, all about the people. Everywhere in the world, most governments pay subsidies. If you go to Germany, German government, they pay over $200 billion subsidy on food in some cases. But here we have taken out all the subsidy, not like we are actually one of the developed economy yet. I don't even know whether we're among the developing economy. A lot of people are saying we are still an underdeveloped economy. But if you look at what that has done to our exchange rate, that has done to inflation, particularly food inflation, and of course the poverty rate is actually very, very humongous. Government actually introduced subsidies to cushion the effect of hardship on the people. Once you take it out and you look at the earnings of the people, is not enough.
Something that we didn't also factor in. I mean, there's only so much graphic you can put in one particular picture, but also something that's not here that I thought is very important to point out is GDP per capita. You've made a point around how GDP per capita has steadily been coming down from 1999 to date, where at this point, I remember it being a bone of contention when the president of the Africa Development Bank made a point that Nigerians back in 1960 had it better than Nigerians today. I mean, there was a whole back and forth around that. But obviously, it's also something quite significant that government has had to spend a lot less on its citizens year on year, if we consider past administrations.
Yes, I think we actually looking at the GDP per capita in 1999 or thereabout, when the new government at this current republic was bettered, we were around the $1,800 per capita. I mean, talking about GDP per capita, we're able to actually move up to about over $3,000 per capita as well, as far back as 2014. But as of today, it is down to around $800 per person or thereabout. If you compare it to our debt, like you and I, Ogabdo, we are owing as much as over 600,000 naira. I mean, talking about debt per capita, that's what every Nigerian is owing, given our current debt profile. So, which I think is quite is something that we should be concerned about as well, instead of encouraging.
I'm waiting for the World Bank to give me a call to try to collect that $800. Then they will see the true Nigerian in me. But of course, fantastic analysis, Yusuf. At least Nigerians have something to go by. The first 2 years of every administration is quite telling about how they're going to finish, because most of them are unable to recover if the first 2 years are not particularly great. And I think history has shown.
And don't forget, politicking has already started. Exactly. We may not see anything better.
Exactly. Well, let's hope Yusuf is wrong on this one. But thank you so much for sharing your time with us this afternoon. That is all we have for you for our special coverage. But of course, we do have some special features that will be coming your way during the course of the day. My name is Abdullahi, Ahmed, from myself and the rest of the team. Thank you for watching and good afternoon.